Hello and welcome to the Coachlogik podcast. I am your host, Max Ada, and I am joined, as usual, by this guy right here, sports scientist Josh Gibson. Josh, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I was thinking about all the titles that you could have used to
That was the nicest intro I've ever
bring
done.
me in. That was
intro.
very nice. I somewhat expect a giggling Gibson at this point, but I guess I'll have to wait till next time.
Well, I've got to mix it up. I got to keep on your toes.
And speaking of toes and developing calves or bigger calves, we wanted to talk about hypertrophy.
Yeah, that's our topic for today. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk a bit about hypertrophy training. I think we probably want to cover some physiological mechanisms. What is hypertrophy, muscle hypertrophy? What are some best practices for how to actually construct a hypertrophy phase or block? And then maybe some caveats that are important.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of go from there.
I think that's a great idea.
Cool. So yeah, I guess from you, the book guy, the nerd of the podcast, sure. What is muscle hypertrophy?
Yeah, I mean, it's just basically changes in hypertrophy. I wanted to say hypertrophy because usually they break up the
hypertrophy
word.
Is what you win when you get jacked.
Yeah, they don't tell you how big you have to get to win one.
That's true.
I think there's an organization called the IFBB. That's where you win the
That's
hypertrophy.
it, yeah.
But no, hyper means beyond. Trophy, I think, is indicative of size. It's like beyond size, right? It's increases in
beyond size. I
Yeah.
like that. That's like that's the new program that's dropping next
Beyond
week.
size.
The Beyond Size program.
And where can they find that, Max?
It's basically an 8-hour arm workout.
You need 16 protein shakes.
Yeah.
But basically, hypertrophy is a standalone word. So hypertrophy can refer to changes in size with anything, really.
You could have a tumor that hypertrophies.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. And you could use that kind of more commonly. It's like, oh, that tree has some sort of hypertrophy. But basically,
hypertrophy.
Hypertrophy. That was very clever. But basically, it's a change in size. We would say muscle hypertrophy. It'd be a little more accurate to say skeletal muscle hypertrophy because, again, you can have visceral muscle, cardiac muscle.
You probably don't have smooth muscle hypertrophy.
It depends on how many calories you're getting. And yeah, Michael Phelps would have extreme hypertrophy of his intestines. But we're referring to changes in muscle size. A lot of that is by adding more contractile elements.
Yeah.
And those contractile. So like you can look at a muscle, and if you look at different textbooks, it's like the entire muscle, which is basically there's connective tissue or fascia covering it. And it's got a bunch of individual muscle fibers, and those are broken down until you get to the level of the sarcomere, which is basically a contractile unit. So it's basically like you can imagine there are two things. I mean, for people who are listening, you're not going to be able to see this. But there are basically two things that pull closer together and then get pulled
like
farther
a
apart.
Zipper, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And that allows the muscle to shorten, right? So it lengthens and shortens, which approximates bones or brings bones closer together. That produces force. That ultimately creates movement. That is done by, again, adding proteins. Protein is basically like the lifeblood of all biological organisms in terms of creating structure. So you have proteins that accumulate and that create the ability to increase in size, to increase the ability to produce force, and then to move weight. You can also have sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is just the addition of non-contractile elements, which would be like changes in fluid, which creates this environment to create changes in muscle size. Yeah. Hyperplasia, which is like splitting of fibers to create more muscle fibers, but that I don't know if that's like realistic for humans. That's been shown in birds when you like weight
theoretical
the wings down.
Thing that can happen in humans.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like not really relevant. There are different types of hypertrophy in terms of the way they the muscles added. So you can get serial hypertrophy, which is the addition of contractile units in series. So you think one in front of the other. If you do a lot of like really full range eccentrics, you can actually add length to muscles by adding sarcomeres in series, and then you have in parallel, which is basically like sardines in a sardine can. So you kind of stack them next to each other. So you get changes in diameter rather than length. So I think that's kind of like, without just droning on, I think that's like a basic introduction to like how muscles change size.
Yeah. And so, the primary, not primary reason, the primary reason to get bigger muscles is to look cool. No, but like the sort of foundational element of, why we would want bigger muscles is that they can typically produce more force, right?
Right.
So we want to, in general, when we do training in pretty much every sport, there's to some degree any weight class sport for sure. When we talk about weightlifting or powerlifting, heavier athletes are going to lift more, right? Because they generally are carrying more muscle mass.
Well, you would say heavier athletes will lift more, and people who maximize the utility of their weight class are going to be better athletes.
Right.
Generally.
The shorter an athlete is in the weight class, as long as everyone's the same weight, so if you're all 100-kilo lifters, the shorter athlete is more likely carrying more muscle, right? Unless they're just really fat, like a pancake. So, that's the fundamental, like, most basic reason why we want muscle hypertrophy, why it's important. Anyone who's watching this probably already knows all that, right? Most people are probably in that perspective place where they've, read or seen 100 other videos on hypertrophy. But the sort of question here we have is not just
what is it?
What is it? Yeah, well, it's how do we do it, but it's also like, why does it occur? So sort of what are the mechanisms? What are the biggest mechanisms that we know are, one, most valuable for us to pursue as far as overload? So like, what mechanisms of growth are worth pursuing? Right. And then to what degree do we find best practices in building programming that, exploits those mechanisms? Right. So from like, what would be the most obvious mechanisms of growth or the things that are going to drive growth in hypertrophy?
Yeah. So I'd say the caveat is with science, the way we actually learn things about you'd say natural world, but like the way we learn things about the world is by creating a test, right? It's like we have an idea, we have a hypothesis. It's like, if this, then that. If this happens, we have these effects. And it's like, okay, let's come up with some elaborate experiment to test that.
Mm-hmm.
So if we create conditions that provide us with information, we'll have a better understanding of the way the world works, right? And that's by like minimizing variables, having very specific access, and being able to precisely measure exactly what we want. There are a bunch of different like considerations in terms of like the timing, like how close something happens to the other thing, how many variables we can assume are at play. And the reason I bring that up is because for some of the mechanisms, one being metabolic stress, it's like, okay, well, if we do some sort of like BFR training, or if we have like a BFR protocol where we like tie off a muscle and we like restrict the ability of blood to return back to the heart, we get this like swelling. And then we have like the accumulation of metabolic byproducts that will sit and not get cleared. And then it's like, well, what effect does that have? It's like, because there's a change in muscle size. And it's like, well, that's like our best guess, or it could be a best guess. It's like, we actually don't know how responsible that is for the changes in size.
Right.
So it's like we try to come up with these elaborate experiments, maybe like high volume protocols to low volume protocols, closer to failure, further from failure. And it's like, what are the differences in outcomes? And then it's like, okay, the more evidence we get that has that specific idea in place, the more confident we can, feel in saying it's probably the volume.
Yeah.
So I'd say the first one, the biggest driver is just going to be like mechanical tension through the muscle. So it's like loading under stretch. So you put a muscle under stretch, and then you basically like push force through it, which is by lifting weight.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like contracting it under load through a full range of motion. That like tension, that stretch, that's going to be a big driver.
Yeah. And so if we just consider like mechanical tension, there's like a threshold, right? There's going to be a minimum threshold as far as like how much tension is really going to elicit some kind of driver or some kind of, response that's going to be hypertrophic. But it does seem like research shows it's probably anywhere like really above like a 30 rep max, right? Like as long as you're above that range, like you're probably going to have enough mechanical tension to actually drive some kind of hypertrophic response.
Because otherwise you could make the argument, it's like, well, if it's not load dependent or intensity dependent, go for a walk.
Right.
Because those are repeated contractions.
Yeah.
And like, that's a viable answer. And it's like, well, it's got to be a certain intensity. And that's why people say like, well, sprinters are fucking huge.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, the forces that go through the muscles when they're sprinting are really high.
Yeah.
So there's probably some effect. Now, they're not going to get as big as bodybuilders because it's not concentrated in a very specific way or dosed correctly.
It's also way higher intensity.
Yeah, it's very high intensity.
Very difficult to accumulate enough volume. So we do know that there's a minimum threshold for, accumulating enough mechanical tension or enough, there's a minimum threshold for intensity to drive response. It's not that high.
Yeah.
It's not significant enough that in the context of building a program for a powerlifter or weightlifter, it's going to be like, oh, I missed the mark because we weren't training heavy enough. If you weren't training heavy enough to drive hypertrophy, you're probably just not training hard enough to be a powerlifter, right? Or weightlifter or whatever it is. So once you're above that threshold, then the question becomes, it seems like proximity to failure within a single set, and then total volume are the two most obvious drivers of hypertrophy. Yeah. Right. Things like metabolic stress, would be like a sort of like tangential thing that's like, it's a question mark that like, if you nail everything else in training, sure, maybe that's something you should look at optimizing for. But that wouldn't be the first thing. It wouldn't be like, okay, I'm building my program around accumulating as much metabolic stress as I can, and that's what's going to drive the greatest hypertrophic response, versus like I should optimize towards volume and proximity to failure.
Well, if you optimize for volume generally, because, and we talk about this, so Hunter was talking about squatting 4 days back to back. He's like, well, I'm a tall lifter and I do lower rep sets and I don't do mini sets. And it's like, actually, to then get the amount of work you need, you kind of have to squat more frequently.
Right.
To get the amount of work you need to change a muscle size, it's like, well, I can't do, I'm not going to do 8 sets for my back in a workout as a weightlifter, because it's just like, you don't have the training resources or the bandwidth to do that. So let's do sets of 12 or 15. Okay, well, if you do sets of 12 or 15 that are relatively close to failure, it's like, it's going to burn. So it's like, some of these things can be inescapable, and it's not inescapable in a bad way, but it's like, how can we bake that in then?
Right.
So we don't have to say, well, I'm just not going to focus on the metabolic side because I don't think it's a huge deal. It's like, we'll build it in so it doesn't have to be a huge deal.
It's what you end up with is a situation where a lot of factors converge on the same point, simply because those all things, this, how to describe this, like, it's almost like there's all things that are the greatest drivers of that adaptation end up in that same area. Right.
Range of motion is one of them,
it's not like you're going to have like, oh, there's like some weird thing where like there's one exercise that has super short range of motion and you can only load it, you have to go extremely heavy, and that drives hypertrophy more than a massive volume that's like, between 6 and 12 reps, that's like pretty heavy and close to failure. Like that, like it's just not some outliers that are like, this one method is so different than everything else, right?
Yeah.
And probably for good reason, because all of those factors do kind of converge in that same place. There's a reason too why when we see like bodybuilder programs, they look similar. Yeah. Right? They look like, that thing.
Well, and people can, you can poo-poo on programs all the time, and we do. We love to.
Yeah.
Because and it's more so like, okay, how do we make this better? It's not like, why is it only bad? But if bodybuilding programs were that bad, people wouldn't be jacked.
Right.
People just wouldn't be putting on size. And I like to think, like, if you think about programs broadly and you think about a certain style of programming, it has to do something correctly. Otherwise, it'd be selected against.
Yes, it wouldn't
get removed from the pool of programs.
Right. It's like why you don't see West Side programs
in weightlifting
in successful athletes.
Yeah.
Right. No one in weightlifting is doing a West Side program, because if it worked, it would be done.
Yeah.
It's also why you never saw top Olympic lifters coming out of West Side.
Yeah.
Because if it worked, they could have gone there and it would have worked. Right.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of them just got injured getting out of the chair they're doing cleans in.
Yeah. The banded cleans with 45-pound iron weights. So we know that this is the case. Do you want to elaborate on any more from, what we know as a mechanistic thing that is essentially the most viable things we're going to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think muscle damage could be responsible.
Right.
But the questions, and the reason I even bring up, so like, I feel like with these podcasts, there are a lot of tangential points we have to touch on to like set up
There's a lot of caveats to like this, and this may not be exactly how it seems.
Yeah. So like you can't uncouple muscle damage from training.
Right.
And even if you could say, well, like I don't feel muscle damage, like, well, you don't know that. I mean, just perceptually, you don't feel soreness doesn't mean there isn't damage. And then it's like, just because you're maximizing damage doesn't mean there's like a one-to-one relationship. And this is a Mike Israetel quote, but he's like, if it were all about damage, go get hit by a car.
Right.
Like that's very disruptive, but that's not going to build muscle. I mean, it might repair a lot of things that are now broken, but it's not going to put on size. So you can't uncouple some of these things well, which is the same argument for does a change in muscle size lead to a change in muscular strength? It's like you can't really uncouple those, and you can't really measure them so well that you can say like, oh, well, muscle size doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to draw the best relationships we can. So there are some thoughts that mechanistically, like metabolic stress, muscle damage might play a role. But generally, I would say you're just focusing on getting effective work done.
Yeah.
And when I say effective work, it's like getting the amount of work you need done in a way where it drives the hypertrophic response.
Right.
Which is like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, if you're short on time, you can do a set, and then you can finish with like myo reps, and you can finish with like myo reps in a lengthened partial position. Yeah. Right. So it's like you're stacking these things that all aid in building size, and then you're using it as like a strategy or a tool. Instead of just saying, well, I can only do 6 sets of 10, or I'm not going to put on the most size possible. And it's like, there are ways you can kind of work around that to get in more work in the right positions. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think work is the thing.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's like largely driven by volume. The volume has to be within the realm of effective training that is going to maximize the amount of weight you lift as far as, optimizing for mechanical tension. It's going to optimize towards volume. So you're not going to use, even though 10 triples is the same volume as 3 sets of 10, 10 triples is so much more difficult to manage, especially from a fatigue standpoint. If you're to do 10 triples, with an RPE or an RIR of like 1, that's a fucking workout.
Yeah.
That's a Bulgarian, like, John Bros-esque workout. Yeah. Like you're just going hard as fuck. It's not going to be an effective way to train, right? But if you did, sets of 8 or 10 where the load is more manageable, you can be closer to failure and not suffer the enormous blow that high fatigue sets with high intensity can cause, you're in a better spot. So it's optimizing for total volume, being able to be within a place where you're close to the proximity of failure, right? Yeah. That gets close. And then, like you said, the other kind of mechanisms or the other kind of factors you would layer on top of those. So if you nail those 2 things, you're going to nail the, 80% of the progress you'll make, most likely. The other 20%, like you said, is going to come from the potential, whatever muscle damage exists, metabolic factors that may or may not have an effect. Doing things like, like myo reps, I would look at more as like an effective use of just the fatigue you can accumulate. So if you're going to do a bunch of work, myo reps might be just a more efficient way of doing it, right? Versus it being like something that's wildly outside of the realm of just, a solid methodology for training. But then also, like you mentioned, lengthened partials.
Yeah.
So it's a great way where it's like, how can we take a very basic program? So if we just look at the actual design of a hypertrophy workout or a session, it might look like, okay, X amount of sets with, an RIR of 2, right? Or whatever, week 1, maybe it starts at 4 or 5 RIR and you build, closer to 2 or 1 or 0 as you progress. And then, the ability to tolerate, the ability to allocate enough sets there that there's a significant enough stimulus that you're going to drive progress. 1 set at 5 RIR, is probably not enough for most people. Yeah. And it might be that minimum effective volume. It might be at some point, but in most cases, for most people, we're already beyond that. Then, as you progress from that, you would incorporate more, what I would consider like not elaborate, but more
specialized.
Exactly. Specialized methodology to augment that process.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like the vanilla option is a few sets, hard, heavy, close to failure, then you would maybe incorporate like, myo reps.
Yeah.
Then you might incorporate, like you said, lengthened partials where you finish the workout with some, whatever, whatever you want to do, seated hamstring curls or something where you're, doing half the rep or whatever, you lean forward. There's probably a bunch of that. I've never done a lot of lengthened partials.
Yeah. Well, and I think ultimately, I think this comes back to like, what can we learn from these strategies? And I think from the lengthened partial conversation that I've just like been on the outside of, is
you listen to like 2 Milo Wolf podcasts.
You listen to 2?
Yeah.
You're way ahead of me.
Well, it's the accent just gets me.
It's the wolf that gets me. Yeah. He's got a dog in him too. I think a lot of it's like, can you set up the position to make it the most lengthened position so you can put the most force through the muscle in like the most vulnerable position, but like the most effective position. And, a great example is I was listening to a conversation where they were talking about training the side delts. And they were like, well, if you take a cable, go behind the back, lean, and get the cable to pull you can actually get a good stretch on that muscle. Whereas like with most movements, it's just not well targeted.
Yeah.
Same with the biceps, right? You do an incline curl and you get a big stretch back with the arm. So I take those principles and I apply that to weightlifting training, where I'm not looking for specific hypertrophy in those exercises, but I'm looking for the most bang for my buck with those exercises.
Right.
So it's like, if I'm going to train arms or train triceps or train back or whatever it is, it's like, okay, let's take those hypertrophy principles and apply those and then specialize the muscle. You can use like weightlifting means, but it just doesn't do the best job of creating the most muscle possible.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's kind of limited.
It's also something to remember too, is that a lot of this is like, to what degree are we trying to optimize for hypertrophy? From a weightlifting perspective or powerlifting perspective, even like the greatest driver of results, which is as far as like we want to lift more weight, is going to be an increase in strength. So hypertrophy serves as a stepping stone to that next goal, right?
Well, and the way that like Zach Robinson or Jake Rimmer, by the way, is going to be on the Coachlogik mentorship.
That's exciting.
In March, and the first free Friday is March 8th. That means the following Friday, Jake's going to be on to talk about individualizing volume for hypertrophy.
Nice.
But basically, the way they talk about it is like with hypertrophy, that's a long-term effect. You're optimizing for the long term. With specificity, with certain training tools or strategies, you're optimizing for the short and medium term. So as you mentioned, it's like we're pushing for the long term, or we're going to hedge on the long term and then make concessions in the short to medium term, because ultimately it's like, what can you do for me in a quad or 2 quads? Not like, I mean, we're at a local meet, we really got a PR.
Yeah. Is it a question for you? Do you feel like, what is your opinion on, I think we both probably agree that in the contemporary powerlifting meta of training, a lot of best practices are adhered to by a larger group of people. I don't think everyone does a great job, but I think that, obviously there's someone has to be the worst. Someone has to be the worst doctor. Think about that. You're the worst doctor. Someone somewhere is the worst doctor.
Usually the worst doctors are saying that diet soda causes cancer.
And Dr. Oz.
Smoke cigarettes.
Someone has to be Dr. Oz. But so we kind of can say, hey, like the broad spectrum of powerlifting, raw powerlifting, drug tested powerlifting seems to be very well dialed into this sort of research, and there's people that are good researchers that are also powerlifting coaches.
Well, that's
smart people that are also powerlifting coaches.
That's why, right?
Yeah.
Eric Helms said, I want to be a PhD. I want to be a doctor. I also want to understand autoregulation.
Right.
Mike Zordos, right? He's the only person, and it was a case study of 3 people, who at least published something that was a squat everyday protocol, right? It was like 37 days, top single, back off doubles or triples.
Carl said he was part of that.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
But so what I was getting to is more that
they're more embedded, right?
Right. Those are closely ingrained.
Cover.
In the sphere of a weightlifting, which we are very much a part of as well. In that sphere, do you feel that training, or let's just call it hypertrophy training, is, multiple choice. A, underutilized.
Sure.
B, done poorly and therefore underutilized. C, is done exceptionally well, being that the requirements of the sport
Sure.
dictate that it's, whatever they're doing is enough.
Yeah.
Or, D, like, none of the above, and you have a different answer.
So I think to pull back just one step and then juxtapose powerlifting and weightlifting. The reason why weightlifting doesn't see the same influx of researchers / practitioners is because powerlifters don't start clubs. They don't have gyms. Really, with powerlifting, it's like, I want to train powerlifting and I want to be a remote coach.
Interesting.
And I just
it's just like powerlifting feels like it's 21st century. It's like powerlifting feels very contemporary in that, and I think we are individuals that have a unique position to identify this because we both work heavily in both sports.
Yeah.
Right. I've had world record holders in powerlifting, all-time world record holders, IPF world record holders, and in weightlifting have had, Pan Am champions. And it's like I've had a great experience at both levels all the way up.
Yeah. I'm the at-home version of Max Ada.
Yeah.
It's like, Mom, I want Max Ada. It's like, we have Max Ada at home.
But we can say this because we have a ton of experience in both sports.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, to that point is powerlifters get into it and it's how can I educate myself on powerlifting?
Yeah.
Weightlifters get into it and it's how can I start a club?
Yeah.
How can I start a team?
The team community kind of thing.
Yeah. So like people are bypassing, or it's not that they're bypassing, they're not even getting to the point where education matters.
There's I would even go so far as to say there's potentially never been a centralized powerlifting top-down government-funded team.
No, well,
even in Russia, it was not a government. I mean, maybe there was money that went there, but it wasn't like the government said, "Let's do powerlifting," and they approached it as though it was a problem, a national problem they had to solve.
One of the closest we've got, and you're gonna laugh, and it's not funny, but like it's West Side.
It's West Side.
I mean that's but West Side is the weightlifting and powerlifting, where it's like we have a brand, we have a team, we have a group of competitors, we have a head coach, right? We have the leader. So when I think about hypertrophy training, I think people just kind of do what they know or they do what they've been given. So we see this informal process of learning from coach to coach. It's like, this is what I've been given. The way I learn how to use velocity-based training is by working with a guy who uses velocity.
Right.
So everything's kind of like incestual in weightlifting, right? You learn from each coach. That was probably not the best word for a sport.
That's going as a clip.
But
that's a clip.
But people learn from the people within.
Yeah.
Right. So we're not either.
I think nepotistic is the word you wanted.
That's the much better.
Get your head out of the weird ass place you're in. It's a West Virginia thing.
So we're not moving outside of the sport, and we're also not moving back into the sport. We're just kind of staying captured within it. I think that it's kind of funny. I think what we need is a more classical model of training, but with a 21st century spin. We need classical periodization of, we have a very general phase, we have a specific phase, a comp phase, and an active rest phase. Because from the short, medium to long term, that actually makes the most sense to me.
Sure.
It's just like, can we take what we know now and embed it better or more correctly? We were talking about top singles being around more often.
Sure.
It's like maybe in a specific phase, it's triple, 3 doubles, 3 singles build up. And that's going to happen earlier than it would have in a classical program.
Sure.
But it still has that same sequence of more hypertrophy focused work, more strength work, into more intensified strength work, still hypertrophy work, into back off the strength work, prioritize the competition movement, see an increase in frequency. And I think it's like we have a blade that's been dulled by years of just poor practice. And it's like, how do we sharpen it? Mm-hmm. And it's taking 21st century tools to sharpen the blade.
So where do you feel weightlifting is with hypertrophy training?
I think it's like
the current situation.
People just phone it in.
Right. You don't think it's being done well?
I think I could do a better job prescribing it. And I say this to you all the time, like the coaching dashboard that you're producing is going to elevate the coaching game because it simplifies the coaching process by capturing all the complexity behind the dashboard, right? So it's like, this is a super simple, I've never used it, but I'm imagine it's like a super simple kind of drag and drop, just plug and play. But then it's like the data gets captured, pulled, and visualized. Yeah. Whereas like when I use it, it's so crude. I feel like a lot of things get lost. So like the expertise I have gets lost in the way the system functions versus having something that's built out more user friendly.
Do you think people in weightlifting don't, I would say, maximize hypertrophy training or optimize towards longer or more deep blocks, like as far as like, let's spend a more prolonged period of time developing muscle hypertrophy because of the benefits we know that are going to be reaped later on? Where it's to say like they don't do that because, one, they've never really seen it done before in ways that were effective, because let's say like the sort of elephant in the room is technique is such a critical component of lifting.
Yeah, it is.
That if you spend any time away from technique, your near limit and limit attempts are worse. And so there's a definite like withdrawal to be like, don't do anything outside of constantly being in practice with snatch and clean and jerk heavy weights. And if you get away from them, you're not going to do well at the meet.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like the system has influenced the way people pursue the sport, which is like, heavy lifts regularly. So you're always touching heavy weights. So you're ready for them, but never really in a place where you can drive significant adaptations to make sweeping changes to yourself as an athlete.
Yeah.
So you're always kind of like, well, stay away from any phase that might add 10 kilos of muscle to me. Because what it would require to do that is some retraction of your technical skills.
Well, and that's why I kind of made this ode to a more classical model where it's like, we're pushing strength work. We're not pushing the classical lifts. Like I'm not going to have you work up to a one arm clean and jerk and snatch, and then not a one arm, but like a heavy pull or heavy squat. I just like the fatigue accumulated from that tends to be a bit too much.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, push it elsewhere. Just do more technical work. Do lower intensity technical work, or more volume, or like more medium volume. So I think what I see in the hypertrophy space with weightlifting is it feels like it's got a more like rehabilitative or rehabilitative bend, where it's like, well, I got to do my, my rear delt flies for my shoulders. And it's like, you're just kind of moving. It's like a recovery session. It's just stress for stress sake.
It feels like the current situation for weightlifting programming is very much one where you do, the athletes do a very narrow scope of rep ranges.
And a very narrow scope of exercise.
1 to 2 reps. 3 is relatively sort of odd, or it's a little high. And you do a very narrow group of exercises and a very narrow group of, training blocks that different from each other.
Yeah.
The blocks are almost always like,
identical.
You'd look at them and be like, oh, that's like a special prep, strength block and a special prep technique block, where it's like you go from like, some like heavier pulls and squats to, less heavy pulls and squats, more heavy lifts. And like, it's just a subtle variation between the two versus, an extended period of time where it's like, okay, I'm going to try to add, 5 kilos of muscle over the next 6 months.
To that point, I just have someone I coached, a powerlifter, just finished a training block, like a program, macrocycle. And I was like, hey, we have 15 weeks to regionals. Let's put on some size.
Yeah.
Try to intentionally gain weight over 8 weeks. And she's like, oh, this is kind of weird. Like, I haven't really tried to intentionally gain weight. I think it, it's one of those things, and I don't do a great job of this or a perfect job, but if you don't track it, you're almost admitting it doesn't matter. So if you say, well, I need to put on weight, and you're either not tracking body weight or tracking your food, that's kind of the concession that it's not important.
It can't matter if you're not tracking it.
Yeah.
You can't have any influence on it if you don't know what you did before, what you're going to do next.
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
Which is obviously the reason why it's so important to have, tools that let you do that. But also like, not even just that, just like that has to be a part of coaching, which is data. Like, take data you learn from yourself, from your individual athletes, and from the broad spectrum of people doing the same sport, assimilate the data and do something with it, right? Like, draw conclusions from it, learn from it, ignore it, whatever it is, but have the data in front of you.
One of my biggest gripe generally is that people will say, well, I don't agree with the white coats. I don't agree with the researchers. I don't agree with the scientists. But they do things that are largely founded on best practices pulled from research.
Yeah. Yeah,
and that's just confusing for me,
I
right?
think there's a difference. There's a difference between the like looking at a research paper that's done on, a bunch of untrained individuals, and it draws some conclusion that's sort of like difficult to be sure of, right? Yeah. And saying, oh, well, this research paper shows that you can whatever build, hypertrophy from loads that are as low as a 30 rep max, right? And so they might interpret that as like, well, you only need 30 rep max, you only need a super low, 35% of your body weight to get stronger.
We would never do that. Yeah.
Or to build more muscle. And it's like, that's not the conclusion. That's one conclusion you could draw from that. But if you look at it from a different perspective, you might say, oh, there's a minimum threshold, and we're definitely going to be within that threshold. So the concern that maybe we don't need to be, like you can look at it differently and say, oh, well, we know there's a threshold and it's pretty low. So we're not super concerned with being in violation of that threshold.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is it's like imagining having a dartboard and saying, I didn't get directly on the bullseye, therefore it's a bad throw. And it's like, well, you got close, right? You got more points.
Yeah.
And every throw is getting closer. And these studies ideally are getting you closer and closer to the knowing what is true.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's what science, the process of uncovering what is true.
Yeah. It's always taking the approach that you are wrong and you're just trying to be less wrong. Yeah. Right. Which I think is a great philosophy, as far as like, if you assume you're wrong, you're never thinking like, what's the right answer? You're just like, how do I be less wrong than I am now? Yeah. Which is maybe just a small step to one side or the other.
Yeah.
So kind of, we rambled a bit, but just to kind of wrap up.
Yeah, I think that's a great
best
place.
Practices.
Yeah.
Like a couple of key best practices. And I want to touch on one other topic with hypertrophy, is like, as far as that is deloading.
Yeah.
Because it seems like, we just have seen a little bit of research that may point to deloading being, I would say, unnecessary, but deloading maybe not having as significant of an impact as we thought for hypertrophy.
So what we should do, instead of introducing it and talking about it at length, is we should get Josh Pelland on the mentorship call.
Let's do it.
Josh is basically doing his dissertation on muscle resensitization. So skeletal muscle resensitization. So it's after a period of detraining, or periods of detraining embedded within a training program, what happens. So he referenced one study where they had one group train continuously, and they had one group take different amounts of time off. I forget what it was, maybe like 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 2 weeks or something. But it's like they had 3 points within that program or training protocol where they had complete time off, cessation from training. Both groups, I believe, had the same progress, or made the same progress. And it's like, okay, but one group did 75% of the work.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it about the time off that allowed them to basically make the same progress as a continuous,
like a 2 steps forward, 1 back kind of thing?
Yeah.
Or 3 steps forward, 1 back.
That's right. So I think we get Josh on. We tackle this concept of like
perfect
muscle resensitization, deloads, time off, and then embed that within the basic structure of the mentorship group, which so far has been training overview. Going to get Jake on for hypertrophy. We'll get Dr. Kyle Travis on for maximal strength. Get Josh on for breaks in training, or training cessation, or deloads, and then we kind of continue that theme throughout.
Sweet. Yeah, I like that. That'll be cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll look for that on the mentorship group. Anyone who's interested, obviously the link is down below to sign up. The mentorship's been pretty awesome so far. I'm excited by the kind of dialogue that goes in. The quality of people could be better in some cases, but in others, very nice. No, Josh has been awesome as far as wrangling some really impressive speakers. That is pretty cool. And I think people that, for those of you that are Olympic weightlifting, you're going to be exposed to people that definitely you wouldn't be otherwise.
Yeah.
That I don't think are as commonplace in the sort of, realm of coaching mentorship that we have here.
Yeah.
So that's super exciting. That's cool. Look for that in the coming month or months, as far as, when you're going to get the mentorship going. Check out the mentorship. We'll have a first free Friday coming up, I think March 8th, I believe it is. So That's a free, anyone can jump in and join the mentorship group. You can jump in on a free sort of preview of it, see what it's like, see what we talk about. Exciting there. So go ahead and check that out. And then
maybe what we should do too is normally we'd have the free Friday, the first Friday of the month.
Yeah.
Since the Arnold will be going on, I'll be coaching. We should do a recorded call or just do a call at a different point and then drop it into the mentorship
Well, I think
group.
the 8th is after the Arnold, right?
Yeah, so maybe we do something in the interim. Maybe like
it's technically not the first Friday. It's the second Friday free. But...
So we can do some sort of like interim Q&A or something just to put something in there for everybody who's involved.
Yeah. There's a ton of stuff. So mentorship group is kicking off. It's really good. Look for the Coachlogik coaching platform. If you're currently stuck using things like Google Sheets or using, something crappy like TrueCoach or, any number of other products out there, and you want more from a perspective of data collection, data curation, the ability to look for trends, do analytics, video analysis. There's some super awesome AI features that are built into the app that are going to be really cool. I don't want to reveal too much of it now, but yeah, it's going to be, in my opinion, from someone who's done remote coaching for decades now, this will be a game changer kind of technology for people. It'll really do what we need our software to do from a coaching perspective. So look for that. MVP should come out sometime in the next couple of weeks. If you're interested, send us a message. You can DM me or you can email any of us, at my Instagram. I was going to say, you can email me, just email me, max@AdaAI, and go from there. But Josh, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Josh_Phil WL. It's PHILWL. You can go to teamada.com and all things Coachlogik, weightlifting.ai, philosophical weightlifting, I think everything's housed under those umbrellas.
Yeah. And if you're interested in remote coaching from me, or you want to get anything, any questions answered, anything like that, then go ahead and check me out on Instagram, max_Ada, or you can go to, teamada.com, sign up for remote coaching, and get some hypertrophy on. We'll see you next time.